Most of us see our body as a physical object that's ours to control. And how most people treat their bodies is usually perceived as no more than a physical expression of the person's individuality. The haircut that I choose, that's just me being who I am. But what if we took a different look? What if we saw our bodies as something whose treatment depends not purely on what the person wants, but on what society expects of them? Social expectations set standards. These concern things like how thin I should be, whether it's okay for me to show hair in public, and when I should hide it. They even guide me about what substances it's okay for me to put into my body, like whether I should smoke or binge drink. We all comply to some extent with these social expectations. And so we shouldn't just see our bodies as expressions of ourselves. The way we perceive ourselves and manipulate our bodies is routinely influenced by our social environment. I spoke to Serene Carder about how we adapt our bodies to fit into social structures. Let's have a seat.
Great.
Talk about adaptive preference.
All kinds of beauty interventions, ranging from ones that seem small, like wearing makeup and straightening your hair every day, to skin bleaching creams, to cosmetic surgery. Well, why do women in the West engage in these things? One story you can tell is, oh, they are just confused or they're just stupid. And I think, that's not the right story. Really, so many of us are doing it because there are also objective benefits attached to doing it. So to use a really simple example, there's data saying that if you wear makeup to a job interview, you're more likely to get a job. And in general, there's all of this evidence tying women's success in professions to meeting what Naomi Wolf calls like a professional beauty qualification. Like, I put on makeup for this interview and I don't wear makeup in life. I don't think that the woman who wears makeup to work, or the woman who wants a career in show business and is getting breast augmentation, is necessarily wrong about what the requirements of her society are. So I think what we need to look at is sort of why those structural requirements are there, and try to change the structural requirements, not just sort of blame victims of a system for participating in the system. In my work, I have kind of talked about this problem as psychologizing the structural. So I say we have a tendency, when the structural constraints aren't really visible to us, to assume that the problem is just that individual people have the wrong values or beliefs.
Some of the ways that we adapt our bodies in order to comply with social structures are more controversial than acts like applying makeup or getting a haircut. One extreme example is female circumcision. This is a case of where people act on the kind of adaptive preferences that Serene Carder was talking about. Appreciating how social structures can limit the choices that individuals can rationally make helps us appreciate why a mother would allow her daughter to be cut, even when it results in a debilitating injury.
Women participate in it for different reasons in a bunch of different places. But one reason that women participate in it in some places is that it's very difficult to get your daughter married if your daughter isn't cut, because we're usually talking about adolescents and young girls in these kinds of situations. And if you live in a society where so much of a woman's access to goods that all of us recognize as goods, like food, shelter, social status, love, depends on her being able to get married, then you can see why somebody would want, even as an act of love, to have their daughter be cut for reasons that have nothing to do with actually wanting the physical injury to her daughter. The view that I just laid out doesn't say that there's nothing wrong with severe female genital cutting. It's widely acknowledged to be a human rights violation by both by people in sub-Saharan Africa and outside of it. But the point is about about the importance of understanding people's reasons for participating in practices, and taking them to be people who have reflected on what they do and make choices about what they do, and the importance of that kind of knowledge to designing interventions to change their lives.
It's a lot easier to see the influence that social structure has on bodies when looking at other cultures than it is when looking at our own. In our culture, one way in which we augment and change our bodies is through the use of science and technology. Our perception of science, of what it can and should do, is much like our perception of our bodies. It's being influenced by prevailing social norms, often without us noticing. If you want to question some intuitively unethical use of science, maybe you should be questioning the prevailing social background, not so much the science itself. I met up with Julian Savulescu to talk about this.
Any powerful technology or powerful thing can be used for good and bad, and science is just another example of that. And often people blame science when the problem is much deeper. So, for example, in India, the reason why people want to have a boy is, firstly, if you have a girl, you have to provide a dowry, often of a couple of years of salary, so it's very expensive. And they believe only a son can perform the funeral rites to enable you to pass on to the next life. And so they choose to have sex selection. Now, you can try to deal with that by banning sex selection, but of course people are going to find a way around it. They're going to have abortions, which may be legal for the purposes of sex selection, or they even engage in infanticide. So the real problem are those cultural and religious values that ought to change, and not banning, the application of science.
We use science to augment and enhance our bodies. This ranges from taking steroids when you're sick, which we think of as ethically sound, to taking steroids in professional sport, which most of us think is unethical. But these judgments reflect prevailing social attitudes about when steroids should or shouldn't be used, not anything about steroids or science per se. Julian Savulescu has developed an interesting test for deciding whether some use of science is morally permissible or not. He calls it the preservation test.
Sometimes people are reluctant to interfere in nature, and so the preservation test says take some property, like just say IQ as an example, but you could pick empathy or you could pick altruism, whatever it is you want. And you've got a child with a high level of that property. Say they've got an IQ of 130, and it's just naturally dropping, and it's going to drop to average. It's going to drop to 100. If there were a vitamin that you could take every day to preserve that child's IQ at 130, do you think it should be provided? And the answer is yes, unless it was dangerous or expensive or created massive social injustice, or parents had other children that they had obligations to. You should preserve that property. But now take the ordinary case where you've got a child with an IQ of 100 and you could give a vitamin. And the child's IQ would rise to 130. People then start to say, oh no, that's enhancement of normal. But if you've got a reason to preserve, you've also got the same reason to enhance. These sorts of thought experiments can expose whether we have a status quo bias or whether there is some morally relevant consideration at stake. And in my view, if we should preserve some property, we should preserve it because it's good, and so we should enhance it.
When it comes to enhancing the body, science is now reaching the point where we might create so-called designer babies. We might select for certain intellectual and physical attributes that we think are going to enhance the life outcomes for a child. But does this mean we might also select against certain genes, such as those that result in disability? This does seem like a very dramatic development.
The important issues around designer babies are essentially two. The first one is, what does make people's lives go better? Are genes for autism spectrum disorders all bad? Or do in some cases they confer different sorts of advantages or ways of experiencing the world? It partly requires science to tell us what the effects are, but also values around what is a good life. And then the second question is around justice. It's true, I think, that this kind of technology could enable the rich to get smarter, to have much better lives, and that to be written into your genes and to create increasing inequality. And again, the choice is ours. We can use that technology to reduce inequality, just as we can use it to increase inequality.
There has been a tendency by people who haven't thought about this much, and also historically, to assume that what a disability is a defect in an individual's body, right? Like, so, if I can't walk that must be because something is wrong with me. One of the things that disability activists have pointed out really nicely is that the social disadvantages that come with that are actually, in fact, a product of my society and not a product of me. So if I am a person in a wheelchair and I can't enter a building, is that because of me or because my society has designed it so that there aren't ramps with which to enter buildings? So there's a nice parallel in the disability literature about whether we're going to focus on defects in individuals or whether we're going to focus on defects in structures and built environments. And a lot of the literature on disability wants to bring up the fact that a lot of the disadvantages that come with disabilities are actually the result of the way that we have constructed society instead of results of the bodies of individuals.
Social structures include large sets of conventions and expectations, and they're not always very visible. They depend on wide patterns of behaviour rather than on what some individual or thing does in isolation. And so we often kid ourselves that they're not there, and we focus on judging the individual or the technology they're using. But next time you encounter some moral claim about what we should or shouldn't do with our bodies, try to think about what might be behind that claim. It might be being motivated by social expectations. What do you think? Next time, is forgiveness ever morally wrong?